Hello guys, this time we'll be working out the opposite color square bishop endgames, and I would like to show you how it can be done in a very efficient way. At least it is my approach and I hope you will like it. First, it is a good idea to know what are the ideas that the stronger side can impose to win the endgame and what is the ways of the defending for the weaker side to make a draw. And now I just make this stuff into the categories, and now let's have a look. There are 4 categories. The first one on the right side with this pen and the sheet of paper, the second one with the exclamation point, the third one with the no entry sign, and the fourth one with the surprise with the box. And what are these in a very brief manner? First are the bishop sacrifice that forces stalemate, the other one, bishop sacrifice that leads to the capture of both pawns when it's an immediate draw, another one, bishop sacrifice leads to a capture of one pawn and transforms into a bishop plus pawn drawn endgame. And the last one, bishop sacrifices that forces reaching so-called blind bishop edge pawn position. I call it BBIP. And now this is the first category about the bishops. The second category with the exclamation point, you can see right here. The defending king and the bishop king control the pawn advance square. The backward pawn move transposes into all pawn bishop color draw fortress. And the last one, the bishop attacks 2 pawns from the rear and stops progress of any of these pawns. This is the second category. The third category, the king cannot surround the defending king, supporting any held with pawn progress. And the last one, the king cannot make progress due to the control of the infiltration squares by either the bishop or bishop with the king, so-called the lack of king progress. And take notice, the last one is not so important, because if you understand the previous ones, the last two are pretty much not so much, let's say, important any longer. And now these are the 3 categories, and I'll just show you how the categories looks like in the positions, and after that we are looking at the diagrams, we'll be looking at the positions, how they can be played out. Let's go. And now, as you can see, the first position. If the bishop captures the pawn on h6, if the king recaptures, we have the stalemate. Therefore, first type of position about the stalemate. The next one, after the bishop captures, the king recaptures the pawn, again stalemate. Another one, bishop sacrifices for 2 pawns. Bishop captures the pawn on g7, the pawn recaptures, king recaptures back, and king bishop against the king, it's a draw, because white doesn't have any pawns to promote. Another category, the same, but the king is a little bit down. After bishop captures the pawn, pawn recaptures, king recaptures the last pawn, it's an immediate draw. Another one with the so-called full bishop or blind bishop. What is this? If the pawn on the edge of the board doesn't have the bishop that controls the promoting square, at this moment the dark square corner, then the endgame ends in a draw. After the bishop captures the pawn, the king recaptures, and then we have the bishop and the pawn against the king. That ends in a draw, because the king cannot be chased away from the corner, and the king is going to be stalemated or the pawn is lost. Another one is the same, but the king is a little bit into the corner. We capture the pawn next to the king recaptures, and the same type of position occurs. And the next one, we have the category about the king and bishop doesn't allow the king to make the progress with the pawn. At this moment, the pawn would like to progress on e7, but the bishop is controlling the e7 square, and the king is controlling the other square for the pawn to progress. Therefore, at this moment, white cannot make the progress, winning the position. Another one, as you can see, bishop will be going back and forth along the diagonal. If any of the pawn moves forward, the bishop captures, especially after c3. Bishop captures the pawn, king recaptures, ends in a stalemate. Next one, we have the pawns on the same color as the bishop, therefore we are just getting with the king a little bit closer, making all of this infiltration stuff impossible, and the king is not going to make a breakthrough, neither the pawns. After that, we have very similar situation. This time we are going with the king into b3, because the king cannot infiltrate the position, the pawns cannot move forward, because the bishop is controlling the diagonal, ends up in a draw as well. Another one, very similar one. This time we do not allow the king to get into the square b3, a3 and b2, because then it can make some kind of tricks with playing king c2, and the king cannot infiltrate. And the last one, we are having the king getting into the other side of the board e2, and the king cannot infiltrate from the other side of the board. And now the next category. The next category is about making the so-called the pawns that are sitting on the same color squares as the bishop. The bishop is the dark square. If the pawn g7 and the pawn h6 would be on the dark square, we are getting into the king, into the light squares, making so-called blockade. Therefore, at this moment, after bishop getting c4 blocking the pawn, white cannot improve the position of the king, and after the pawn move forward h6, we are blocking the pawns, and then white cannot make any more progress. Another one, very similar, this time only difference is that the king is attacking the pawn. Of course, first we need to play the bishop c4 to control the promoting square of the passed pawn. After the king would capture the pawn will run away. Therefore, first bishop must get into c4, and after that, if the king gets closer, the bishop will be going back and forth along the diagonal, and at this moment, white cannot improve the position anymore. And now another one, if the bishop is attacking two pawns from behind, from the rear, and now you can see both pawns are on the diagonal. And now, very important, if the pawn gets to h7, blocking the king, let's say improvement on h7, we are getting bishop on the dark diagonal, on the long diagonal, and the pawns will not be able to make a progress. After the king gets to h7, with the idea g6, g7 check winning, after the bishop gets e3, king would get to h7, bishop captures the pawn, and we are having an easy draw as the bishop will capture another pawn, ends in an immediate draw. Another one, the king cannot improve the position because the king cannot surround the defending king. Therefore, at this moment, bishop will be going back and forth along the diagonal. If the pawn moves forward to g6, we sacrifice the bishop for two pawns, capturing twice. And if the pawn gets into the dark square h6, we are blocking with the king on the square g6 and going back and forth. Again, they cannot do anything. The game ends in a simple draw. Another one, if the bishop is getting into the square g7, it cuts off the king into any progress. Therefore, after bishop g7, the king cannot get any further. If the pawn move forward, attacking the king and the bishop with the fork, we capture on h6, pawn recaptures one more time, king recaptures, and immediate draw arises. Another one, after the king gets into f7, the king stops the king from infiltration to g6, the king cannot get into h5, and again, if the pawn gets into f6 with white, we capture twice with the bishop and the king ends in a draw. If the pawn gets into the g6 square, we are making the blockade along the dark squares, ends in a draw very simply way. And now the type of fortress. If the king and the bishop are working together, not allow the king to make the infiltration into the position. Now, as you can see, even though the pawns are pretty much separated, now the bishop gets into the square b7, not allowing the king to sink in into the a7 square when it's going to be the winning position. After bishop b7, all of these squares are covered by the bishop and the king, and white cannot make progress. Another one, we have the bishop that is not allowing the king to progress, but white king tries to progress into the d6, c7, and then the win will be again with white hands. After the king gets to e6, again, at this moment, white king cannot improve the position any further. The bishop will be going back and forth along the diagonal, and if the pawn gets into the f5 square, we capture, and then ends up in a very easy draw. And the last one, after we have the previous position, now we can have two ways of making this position drawn. The first one is king d5. If the pawn moves forward, we capture the bishop and the pawn, and the other is king f5. After the king gets to c5, getting into d6 as the threat, we come back with the king into e6, going back and forth with the bishop, not allowing the king to get a6, and the game ends in a draw as well. And now, one more time, very quickly about these categories. The general one, bishop sacrifices itself. The second one, the defending king and the bishop keeps control the advanced square, and the pawns cannot get into the healthy progress, as they say, and the bishop is attacking two pawns from the rear, stopping the progress of any of these pawns. And the last category, the king and the bishop are supporting each other to make either the progress, either the position that the opponent's king cannot infiltrate, the pawns cannot be pushed as well. Therefore, at this moment, it ends up in a draw. The last part of this stuff is not that much important because it's super, let's say, seldom. Therefore, you do not need to worry about it. If you understand the previous three categories, the ones right here, and right there, you will understand this one with some kind of experience and analysis along the way. And now let's have a look at these positions at play. And now we have the positions, as we can already see. All of the positions will be played out. And now, what is this position? This is the position that is a draw. Why is that? First of all, let's have a look what are the pawns movement. After the pawn move forward, if the pawn gets to g7, we can sacrifice the bishop for 2 pawns, ends up in a draw immediately. After the bishop captures, we recapture, and now the game ends in a draw due to the lack of material. And now another way is to push the other pawn. If I push the other pawn on h7, take notice, if the pawns will be standing on the same color as the bishop of the attacking side, then the game ends in a draw, because we are blocking the pawns with the dark squares, and the king will be sitting on the square. The bishop will be going back and forth along the diagonal, and you cannot improve the position any further. Of course, if you sacrifice the pawn, we can capture, and after that we are controlling g7 square anyway, therefore the game ends in a draw very easily. Therefore, pushing any of the pawns doesn't help anyhow. That's why white starts with the bishop, and now black needs to decide where they are going to do. Into the f8 square or into the corner into the h8 square. And let's check it out, both of them. First, let's get into the draw idea. King f8. Why is that? Again, after h7, we are blocking the king and making the blockade along the dark square, and the pawns cannot move any further. And now if the pawn moves forward g7, of course we sacrifice the bishop for 2 pawns, and then we achieve the draw again. And now what would be another way to improve the position? The king cannot improve any further with g7 check then winning, because bishop is cutting off this square. Now the king cannot get the other way to push back our king, because our king has these squares covered, and the king cannot approach into any of these squares. Now therefore, white doesn't have any other ways to win it. Therefore, at this moment, black is just sitting in the bishop onto this diagonal, and if the pawn pushes forward to g7, we capture it twice. If the pawn gets h7, we are getting the blockade along the dark square diagonal, and it ends up in a draw very easily. And now what would it be if we get the other way with the king? Not in the f8 square, but in the corner. This is the blunder. And you can say, wait a second, how is it a blunder? If we again can sacrifice the bishop for 2 pawns, and if the pawn gets h7, we are making the blockade along the dark square diagonal. How is it a blunder? The idea is here that the king, if the king gets into one of these squares, f7 or h7, the attacking one, after g7 check, if we capture, they can recapture, and the king will be still protecting the pawn, and then black will be checkmated. And therefore, the idea that this position is lost is due to the king infiltrating into one of the squares and then supporting the pawn g7 advancement. And now, after the king here, take notice, you cannot attack the pawn from the rear, because after bishop gets there, pawn check, the king cannot capture, the king must go into the square h7, and the pawn is promoted, protected by the bishop. And therefore, at this moment, you cannot do any legal moves right here. And now, after the bishop is going back and forth with the idea of waiting, we are going closer. Now, the threat is going here with the check stuff. If the king gets closer, not allowing the king to get any further, we have the discovered check by moving the king. And now the king must go into the corner. And now at this moment, after the king is on the light square, next move is the g7 check after bishop captures. We recapture, and the pawn advance with the checkmate. Therefore, at this moment, due to the king supporting the pawn, white could have won this position. And this is the idea, that it's not about just making the pawns immobile, but not allowing the king to progress the position and then supporting the promotion idea with the king. Therefore, be careful about moving this too quickly. But anyway, this position is drawn, as you probably now already know. And now another position. Let's have a look at this one. Is it a draw or is it a loss? At this moment, as we can see again, the bishop is covering the g7 square. If you push the pawn forward, we capture twice. Therefore, at this moment, a very easy draw. And if the other pawn moves forward, we are blocking the pawns on the dark square. Bishop gets to g7, and the bishop will be going back and forth along the dark square diagonal, drawing easily. Therefore, this one doesn't work. If white starts with the bishop, now they are getting into the corner. And now, normally, as we previously said, after the king f7, it's going to be the win position due to this support of the king. But at this moment, surprise, if the king gets into this square right here, after the capture, the game ends in a draw, because the king doesn't have any legal moves, therefore it ends up in a draw. Of course, if the king went into f6, bishop captures the pawn, therefore you cannot do anything. And now at this moment, even if you push the pawn forward, we sacrifice twice, and again still a draw. Therefore, at this moment, a little bit of exception, that the king cannot improve the position because the pawn will be lost. And now another position. This time the pawns are not on the 6th rank, but one of the pawn is on the 6th, the other is on the 5th rank, and protecting the more advanced one. And now is this position that is winning. Black to play. First of all, we cannot allow the king to get into the pawns and make the pawns into the straight line with the check, because it's going to be the win position. Therefore, at this moment, pretty simple plan. Make the king a little bit closer to the opponent's king, not allowing any progress of the king. And of course, if the pawn moves forward, we capture. If the other pawn moves forward, we capture. Both ends up in a pretty easy draw. Of course, if white attacks the king, now we cannot get into this one because the king will get right there. It's going to be pretty easy win. But we are going right here, not allowing the king to progress any further. And again, if the pawn h6 is moving forward, we capture the pawn, easy draw. And if the pawn g7 tries to get into promotion, we simply block it and control the promoting square with the bishop. And again, the king cannot make any progress. After the pawn move forward, we are getting into the king into the light squares, and then it's going to be an easy win with, an easy draw with blockading on the light squares. Of course, if the king step back, let's say into this square, we are attacking the pawn, and the pawn is lost. Because you cannot protect the pawn, after pushing the pawn forward, we capture anyway, and the game ends in a draw easily. Therefore, do not allow the king to advance and control the promoting square. After the pawns will be at the same color as the attacking bishop, when we are blocking on the light square, pretty easy draw. Another position, we have the pawns on the 6th and 5th rank, but this time the pawns are not on the light squares, but on the dark squares. How does it change the outcome? Let's check it out. Let's have a look what would happen if this would be white to play. If black to play, of course, it's pretty easy. Then they can try to block the king, but of course, take notice, it may not work as yet. Therefore, there will be maybe the other plan. And now in a moment, you'll see what is this plan all about. After king g8, the idea is to push the pawn forward. And then after the pawns are on the 6th rank, it's going to be the win. Therefore, there's only one drawing move by the black king. Black king gets to g8. And now, why is that? Because at this moment, if you can recognize the pawn and the bishop, if they are on the edge of the board, I mean the pawn is on the edge of the board, the bishop must control the promoting square in order to win. If I can sacrifice the bishop for the pawn on the g file, then the win is not possible any longer. And now at this moment, after the bishop attacks the king, take notice, we have only 3 squares to go, and now we are going into this square f8 with the same idea as previously. And now what can be done? After the king gets closer, the idea is to get with the king to h7, pushing the pawn g7, and then supporting the pawn as one of the previous examples, an easy win. And that's why we need to attack the pawn from the rear, attacking the other pawn as well. And now 2 ideas comes to mind. The first idea, if the king gets closer with this stuff as we already mentioned. Of course, the king getting to h7 is not protecting the pawn, therefore we capture. The next move, sacrifice the bishop, ends in a draw immediately. And what happens if the pawn moves forward this way? Of course, we are getting the bishop right here, not to make any more possible progress by the pawn. And after the king step back, we can of course get with the bishop back and forth along the diagonal, and the pawns can never move into the, let's say, promotion, because we have the control of the squares. Take notice, if the pawns would be on the same diagonal as the bishop, we are just blocking them on the dark squares, very easily making a draw. And therefore, at this moment, after the king gets h6, we are getting right here. At this moment, we are just waiting for the pawns to get into the light squares, and then the bishop will be making the draw pretty easily. Of course, at this moment, if the king gets h6, we can have another idea with the stuff related to the pin. Because at this moment, take notice, this bishop will just capture the pawn. After the capture, the king gets here a draw, but the problem would be the pawn advance with check. Therefore, be careful. Try always have the priority about protecting the promoting squares before you capture the other pawn. That would be the concept that would be okay. But of course, there is the exception, the pawn advance into the promotion. And now at this moment, it's going to be a pretty easy draw for white. And now, what would it be if we start with the king h5 is the first idea, and after king h5, if we just do not make the king g8, but after that we are going the bishop right here on the long diagonal, just make the different move order. Let's check it out. After bishop here, unfortunately it's a blunder. Why is that? Because now the king cannot escape up to the g8 square, and you cannot stop the move g6 because you do not have such a move. At the same time, the king will be on the dark square, and then the idea of g6 and then getting into this stuff, as we all analyze with the pawn h7, pawn g6, g7 getting to promotion, is unstoppable. And that's why at this moment, after the check, the king has the only legal move. Now the king step back into the light squares right there. Take notice, you cannot attack and capture the pawn h6 because g7 check and g8 is promotion. You cannot stop it. And that's why at this moment, the same plan will be applying right here with this idea, and then pushing the pawn forward, promoting the pawn easily. Even after bishop captures, we recapture. Therefore, be careful, because some of the endgames are a little bit tricky, but I can assure you, if you just analyze them step by step and understand the ideas, you can just play it out pretty much correctly and efficiently. And now let's have a look at the same position, but this time with black to move. With white to move, we of course knew that after king h5, we have the idea of king g8 and then bishop d4 with the diagonal control by the bishop, pretty easily drawn. But what happens if this black to move? If black to move, it's a way easier, because after we capture the pawn is on the edge of the board and the bishop doesn't control the promoting square, therefore an easy draw. But now what happens if the king gets h5 and again they push the pawn into g6? Of course, we capture the bishop after they captured an easy draw, as we just mentioned. Therefore, this plan is not going to work. If you push the pawn g6, we capture with the king and then block the pawn onto the dark square, pretty easy draw. And the last approach is, instead of going here, getting with the bishop check. And now again, we are getting into the square either g8 or h8. At this moment, h8 is a little bit easier, because now at this moment, the opponent cannot win. Why is that? Because first of all, they cannot push the pawn into g6, because the pawn will be captured. And if they push the pawn into h7, we are blocking the pawns on the long dark diagonal. Pretty easy win. Pretty easy draw. Therefore, at this moment, even if the king gets there, it doesn't help, because we sacrifice the king and end up in a pretty easy draw. And of course, if they are going with the other pawn right here, we capture with the bishop and then pretty easy draw as well. Of course, after the king gets here, and now if they want to get here with this idea, going with the pawns into g7, again we capture one of the pawn and the game ends in a draw due to the idea of the pawn that is not supported by the bishop controlling the promoting square. And now let's have a look at another example. This time we have analyzed the pawns on the 6th rank, the pawn on the 6th and 5th rank, now the pawns on the 5th rank next to each other. Now what is going on? First of all, we need to see if this is possible to win and how. Of course, after the position is right here, always try to see if the pawn advance is possible. After the pawn getting into the f6, we capture twice by the bishop, ends in a draw. If the pawn gets into the light square, we are blocking with the king into either g7, into f6, both are okay. And now at this moment, after the blocking of the diagonal, bishop will be going back and forth, and you cannot make the movement of the pawn into f6 because it's going to be captured. You cannot surround the king from the h file because the king is covering this. And if you get the king right here, the bishop will capture the pawn anyway. It doesn't help for white. Therefore, at this moment, we need to play out either the bishop from one side or the other to push the king either to the 7th rank, either to the 8th rank. And now let's check out both of this stuff. First, bishop h5. And now what are the replies by black? Black doesn't allow the pawn getting into f6, moving the king into e7. Take notice, it's very important, because e7 doesn't allow the opportunity to progress for white, that we'll see in a moment. After the bishop gets here, take notice again, after king e7, you cannot push the pawn, because bishop sacrificed twice with the king recapturing, and game ends in a draw. And now you cannot improve the position right here, because the bishop is covering this square, right? And therefore, at this moment, if you push the pawn g6, again, we are making the blockade along the dark square diagonal. The pawns are on the light squares. The bishop is on the light square. It cannot attack the king on the dark square. The game ends in a draw in a pretty simple way. And that's why, at this moment, bishop is getting g6, protecting this pawn. And now white is waiting for black what we are going to do. And black is just going back and forth along the diagonal. If the pawn gets to f6, they sacrifice twice, and white is trying to get the other way from the other side of the board. Now, black is trying to hold on onto the diagonal because nothing happens right now. The pawn g6 cannot be pushed because bishop blockades. After f6, we sacrifice twice, ends up in a draw. After the king gets to h5, now we need to stop the king infiltration from the h6 square. Now, bishop gets into the square g7, stopping the king infiltration. At the same time, if you push the pawn forward with the fork, you sacrifice 2 pawns for the bishop, ends up in a draw. Therefore, it's not possible. And now, what can you do? If you put the bishop into one of these squares, e8 or f7, we capture with the king. And now, if you put the bishop h7, in order to allow the king to infiltrate into the square g6, we stop this infiltration, playing the king into f7. And now, again, if you push the pawn forward, we simply block with the king on the dark squares pretty easily. Therefore, it ends up in a draw. If you push the pawn forward f6, we capture with the bishop twice, ends up in a draw. And there are no other winning ideas. The king cannot infiltrate right here. If the bishop makes the check right there, we step with the king here, and still the king cannot move forward. And now at this moment, the king cannot get from the other side, because the king is sitting on the dark square. On this side, the king is not going to make any progress, because bishop cuts off the square h6. If the bishop step back, our king is cutting off the square g6. The pawns cannot progress, as we just mentioned before. Therefore, the game ends in a draw. Therefore, at this position, after the bishop gets h5, the game ends in a draw. And now, what would happen if the bishop would get this way, you may ask. And now, at this moment, what happens if we get king e7? Is it a draw or not? Take notice, at this moment, the bishop was a little bit disturbing the king. Therefore, what would it be if we just play king e7? Is it a draw? Nope, it's not, because we are getting with the king right here, and the and the king and the bishop will not be able to stop the infiltration. Therefore, the correct move now is getting king g7, because even if the king tries to sink in right here, it cannot get right there because of this squares covered. Of course, if the pawn move forward, we capture twice, ends up in a draw. If the pawn gets into light squares, we make the blockade along the dark squares, with the bishop getting back and forth along the long diagonal. And you cannot improve the position with the king, because the king cannot infiltrate e5. And now, what happens if the king tries the other way? After king right here, we are going with the bishop. If the king gets closer, with the bishop. And again, you cannot push the pawns, because we just captured twice. After pushing the pawn g6, the bishop will be going back and forth along the diagonal, as the blockade on the dark square diagonal will be established, and the game ends in a draw. Therefore, you cannot improve the position anymore. Take notice that this position should be studied a few times in order not to collapse, because sometimes some of the versions may be a little bit difficult in order to understand it for the first time. Therefore, I encourage you to study it a few times. Therefore, at this moment, bishop h5, and we are getting the king e7 a draw, bishop right here, the king g7 a draw, and the last attempt with the king g4. Now, what can be done? At this moment, of course, we are waiting for the king to pop up closer. After king h5, now we are getting with king g7, not allowing any progress. After pawn f6, we capture twice, ends in a draw. After the pawn gets into the light squares, we are getting the build up the dark square blockade, ends in a draw as well. And of course, if the bishop is sitting on the light square, king is sitting on the dark square, the bishop cannot chase away the king. Therefore, the game ends in a draw after a few of the moves. And now take notice that again, at this moment, they cannot sacrifice the pawn, because we captured twice. And what is important, the king cannot infiltrate. And now at this moment, the game ends in a draw pretty easily. And now at this moment, very important idea, that now we need to go with the bishop here in order not to allow to progress. And now again, what happens? You cannot step back with the king right here, because the pawn would be hanging. And of course, if you push the pawn f6, we capture twice and ups in a draw. Okay, I hope now you understand this position. Take notice, it's one of the positions that you need to study a little bit more. Try out all of the variations. If you do not understand it, you need to play out simply and see what ideas are implemented by the engine or the sparring partner, or if the coach is playing against you. And now what happens at this position? This time we have two pawns that are next to each other on the fifth rank. And take notice that previous position was a little bit different. Why is that? Because we have one open file along the h file, and now at this time we do not have this. Therefore, the king cannot surround the king with the h file, only two pawns are right here. And now again, we have the pawn on the h file. Now, if the bishop is not supporting the corner, we can just sacrifice the bishop, but this time the bishop is supporting the corner. Therefore, at this moment, we cannot sacrifice the bishop for the g-pawn if it advances forward, unless we sacrifice the bishop for two pawns. Then it's pretty easy draw. And now how at this moment white can try to play for the win. First idea is to push back the king. And now where we are going with the king, h7 or f7. Take notice, try not to get into the corner as long as the king cannot make the surrounding and push back the king. Therefore get the other way, even if it sounds or looks a little bit counterintuitive. After king s7, again, if the pawn moves forward, you're sacrificing the bishop twice. If the pawn gets into the dark square with all of the pawns on the dark square, you establish the diagonal blockade along the light square diagonal, and then the blockade is working perfectly. And now at this moment, what can be else done by the opponent? Now at this moment, we played the king f7. Neither of the pawn can move forward because it's end up in a pretty easy draw. And after the pawn g6, we sacrifice twice, ends up in a draw. And now what else you can do? Even if you try to get with the king right here, still the king is not moving at all. You cannot push back the king. Therefore, at this moment, you cannot improve the position any further. Take notice, bishop on the dark square, king on the light square. The bishop cannot touch the king as long as the king doesn't get into the dark square. Therefore, the game ends in a draw pretty easily. Another position. This time we have one file, the pawns separated, therefore the pawns are not next to each other. And now let's check it out if this is a draw. And now at this moment, what are the tasks for black? Take notice that if the king gets into the squares that the pawn will be supported by the king, then the game is over, white wins. Therefore, at this moment, black needs to make two tasks for the bishop and the king efficiently. And now how they can do it? First, they need to make this pawn protected. If they get with the king right here, take notice, if the bishop will be going into this diagonal, the pawn will be hanging, and after the pawn moves forward, we can just sacrifice it. Therefore, first idea with the king is attacking the bishop, because even after the pawn is captured, they have another pawn moving to promotion. Therefore, the bishop step back into this diagonal, and now there is the threat of capturing the pawn. After capturing the pawn, the endgame is pretty easily drawn. That's why bishop protects it. And now, if the king gets into f7 and then they push forward, then it may be a winning idea, unless we can capture on the e7 square with the bishop. And that's why we are getting with the king into d8. Now, if the king gets into the square f7, as you can see, the bishop will be controlling this square. After you push the pawn forward, capturing here, even if the pawn gets the other way, we recapture right there, ends in a draw pretty easily. Therefore, after the pawn forward, we are waiting. After the king captures and the pawn decoys the king, after the pawn forward, we are just sacrificing the bishop, ends up in a draw. Therefore, at this moment, both squares were covered by the king and the bishop, and therefore, at this moment, even if the pawn c7 would just decoy the king, it ends up in a draw pretty easily, as we just shown. And the other way is true as well. If the pawn gets e7, we capture. After the pawn moves forward, we capture anyway, and the same ends in a draw. Therefore, this position, even with the one pawn separated, may be still a draw. And now let's check it out. What happens if the pawns are separated by 3 files? It seems like 3 files is a lot, therefore it should be a pretty easy win, isn't it? Not so quite. Why is that? Because at some specific cases, black can hold the position, establishing the fortress. Fortress or the blockade, call it whatever you wish. Now, at this moment, as we can see, the king cannot get any of the ideas other than getting into c7, and then the pawn will promoting, bishop must sacrifice, and then king recaptures, bishop protects the pawn, and this is the winning attempt. Therefore, if the king gets into one of the attacking king is getting in one of these squares right here, as you can see, the position will be won. Therefore, we cannot allow the king to do so. After king c5, of course, the plan is to get into the square d6 and c7, then end up in a draw. Now we are getting with the king, not allowing the king to progress any further. And now what they can do? They cannot get the other way as long as the bishop is controlling the a6 square. They cannot move the pawn up to b7 because the pawn is fixed by the bishop. They cannot push the pawn because the pawn would not be protected. We can capture either the bishop or the pawn, winning, drawing easily. Therefore, they need to try to make us into the Zugzwang. Bishop c7 is the first attempt of protecting the pawn, and then they try to go like that with the pawn as the plan. And now, at this moment, the king cannot approach any closer. Therefore, we are moving with the bishop. And now, what white can do? They cannot push the pawn because we capture. They can try to go right here with the king, and then if the king gets to e7, then the endgame is won. Therefore, king gets there, and now immediately we need to stop the king from infiltration to a6 by having this square covered. And again, the king cannot get right here, they cannot get right here, the pawn cannot advance because we capture, and that's why we are moving with the bishop, waiting for us. Now, we cannot allow the king to get into a6, a7, therefore we cannot move the bishop from controlling the square a6. And take notice, if we get the bishop c8, the king gets c6, c7, still a win. Therefore, these two squares must be controlled by the bishop, and therefore we are waiting with the king. Either right here, either right there, both are good. This one is a little bit simpler because we are fixing both of the pawns. And again, if the bishop will go going back and forth, we are going back and forth with the king into the e6, f5 squares. And if the king gets right here in order to get into the d6, now in time we are stopping the infiltration, and then the bishop will going back and forth. As long as the king is getting into b5, then the bishop needs to control a6 and c6 square. The king will be going back and forth over the f6, f5, e6, f5 with an easy draw. And now the extreme position. You may ask me, thinker teacher, are there positions that we can have 3 pawns advantage? The opponent doesn't have any pawns and it is still a draw? Yes, there are some positions that I would like to show you. These are the extreme positions. Take notice, even if it looks ridiculous, they are still drawn. Why is that? First of all, you probably may see that we just mentioned if the pawns are on the same diagonal as the bishop, then these pawns will be pretty easily blockaded by the king and the bishop. In this case, in a drastical way, with 3 pawns advantage, black cannot win. First of all, what would it be if these pawns would disappear? The bishop will protecting the pawn on the h file, at the same time, on the a file, at the same time, the bishop is not controlling the promoting square. Therefore, if these 2 pawns are gone, it's still a draw. The second idea, if this pawn is gone, it's still a draw, because bishop will be going back and forth along the diagonal, and if the pawn advances, we capture the pawn. And that's why at this moment, no matter which pawn is gone, it's still a draw. Either of the pawn may be gone, and it is still a draw. And now, what would happen if black to play tries to make all of this stuff right here and try to promote the pawn up to the promotion square? After c3, there is the idea of going check, and after that trying to go here with this stuff and promoting. But at this moment, we just sacrifice the bishop, and after the king captures, we are into the stalemate position. Because the pawn is protecting the other pawn, the pawn is covering the escape square for the king, and the king cuts off the escape square for the white king as well. Therefore, at this moment, if the pawn moves forward, we simply capture the bishop, regardless what is this pawn. Either b2, either c3, and if the king recaptures, it's still a draw due to the stalemate. Let's check out another position. Again, the same feature. Black is 3 pawns up. At the same time, all of the pawns are on the diagonal with the same color as the bishop, and we have the opposite color with bishop. Normally, it would not be possible with the same color square bishops. What is the idea behind it? First of all, we cannot allow the king to make 2 pawns on the squares next to each other on the 3rd rank or the 6th rank, depending on the perspective. The most, let's say, drastical part would be to allow all of the pawns get into the 6th rank, and then the endgame would be pretty easily won. But as long as the pawns cannot move forward because they will be captured by the bishop, the king must support the pawn progress. But maybe we can stop it. How? Getting into the square with the king and with the bishop. And now at this moment, they cannot move forward because the bishop would capture. If this pawn is going forward, we capture. Therefore, we are just waiting for the opponent. Take notice, we are blocking both pawns right here. Therefore, only one pawn can move forward. After we capture, it's still a draw. And now they are trying to hold on and try to keep up some tricks with the bishop. Some kind of a little bit like Zugzwang. And now at this moment we are going with the bishop back and forth along this diagonal as long as we need to change the plan a little bit in the later stage. After the bishop step back, again, you cannot move any of the pawns because we capture with the bishop. Therefore, after stepping back, again, the threat is to put 2 pawns onto the 5th rank by the king and the pawn. Therefore, we need to stop it, getting this square covered by the king. And now, at this moment, again, if I push forward, we capture. And now one important moment. If I try to deflect us, First, we push the bishop right here, not to allow to push the pawn. After the king captures, we capture here, and even if the king gets there, it's still a draw with the same idea. The bishop will be going back and forth, and we are just controlling the squares. Therefore, still a draw. And now, what happens if I try the other trick? We are trying the Zugzwang, make us into the Zugzwang. Therefore, we are going with the bishop back and forth. And now, the king is trying to get right there, and then maybe right here with pawn promotion. Now, we are going back and forth with the bishop and the king. Take notice, this one would be good, but first we are predicting that they cannot get right here from the square a5. Therefore, we are going here. Take notice, bishop is still keeping up an eye on the pawn progress by any of the pawns. Now, bishop is hanging, therefore we need to step back. And now after that, the king tries to get into the square b4 and then trying to push the pawns. Therefore, at this moment, we are not allowing the king to make any progress. The king and the bishop are on the opposite square than the bishop. The pawns cannot move forward because any pawn movement is into the capture by the white bishop, and therefore the game ends in a draw. And now let's have a look one more position that is a little bit difficult to understand, but step by step we can make it. Now, the pawns are a little bit different because the pawns are not on the same diagonal, but still all of the pawns are on the same color as the bishop. And now it seems like this position must be won, but in fact it's not. Why is that? Because still you cannot improve the position of the pawns because we'll capture both of them. And if the king tries to get into one of the position next to the king, we are just simply not allowing the king to get into this position by pushing the king back. If the king tries to get into the other position, we are getting with the king, pushing back the king, and still a draw. And now how it goes into the practical application. After king b4, now we are going with the king going here, not allowing the king to get any closer. Any pawn movement results in losing the pawn, therefore you cannot make any progress by the pawns. After the king gets there, now with this idea, we are throwing the check. Of course, after the check, we are just capturing again, therefore it's not working. And after king step back, we are going back and forth with the bishop, having the squares covered. The king cannot approach from this side because we are having the king that is not able to be pushed back, especially the bishop is on the dark square. Therefore, the game ends in a draw. And now what would happen if we tried the king from the other side to get into the position and try to push the other pawn, you may ask. After the king here, we know it's already a draw. What happens after the king gets the other direction? Now we are getting with the bishop right here to have all of these squares covered and make the pawn fixed. After the king gets closer, we are going with the bishop, with the king, and now, again, neither of the pawn can advance. If the pawn move forward, we capture. After the king gets closer, what do we do? Again, we are going back and forth with the bishop along the diagonal. The king cannot approach any closer because all of these squares are covered by our king, and still the king is not going to make any pawn advance supporting the pawn. Therefore, the game ends in a draw, regardless if you go from this side with the king or if you select this plan with the king right here. Neither of the plan works because of king c2 or because of the king e2. Therefore, neither of this is possible to execute. That's why a draw. And now the time for the summary. As you probably have seen, we have all of these positions into the categories, and as I just mentioned, there are the draw positions to show you how the endgame can be drawn. The next episode we'll be looking at the positions that are similar but they will be winning, and you will see what are the differences between these positions that are drawn and the position that we'll be studying the next episode that are won. I encourage you to study these positions step by step, role play the more difficult ones a few times with all of the, let's say, ideas that you can check out either with the engine, either with the sparring partner or the coach, and step by step check out if these ideas that I am just showing right now can be applied. And I'll just remind these ideas very quickly. The first ideas are related to the bishop. The second one with the king and the bishop securing the pawn advance. The third one with some kind of fortress, the king and the bishop not allowing the king to make the progress. And now very quickly about these positions that I'll just show you that were drawn. And now these are these positions. The first one, the stalemate factor. Now, sacrificing the bishop for 2 pawns, immediate draw. Now, sacrificing the bishop to make the position with the edge pawn, and the bishop is not covering the square promotion. Now, the bishop and the king is not allowing the pawn to advance. The bishop is covering the pawn advance, securing the draw with sacrificing the bishop and resulting to the stalemate as well. Now, the king and the bishop is covering the infiltration square for the king and not allowing the pawn to progress. This is the same. Now, this is the same. This is the same. Now, the bishop is covering the promoting square and not allowing the king to make the progress. If the pawn progresses, then the king gets the blockade along the light square diagonal. And therefore, at this moment, the king cannot support the pawns any longer, because if the king step back, our king will attack the pawn and win it. This is the same type of position. And now the less, let's say, common, but sometimes it's useful as well. The bishop is attacking the pawn from the rear, attacking the backward pawn in order to either force the pawns to get into the position that will make the blockade, or to capture the pawn if the king is not protecting the pawn and making the progress. Now, the king cannot make the surrounding idea with the other king, because we are just standing with the king on the opposite color than the bishop. The pawn cannot advance, because either we are sacrificing the bishop for 2 pawns, or making the blockade on the light squares. Now, the same idea, but the bishop is not allowing the king to make the progress. Now, this time, the king is stopping the king for progress, because the bishop is cutting one square. The king must take out the other one. Now, the typical fortress, as we just shown, with a little bit more advanced examples, if the pawns are more separated from each other. The bishop is cutting off the progress by the king, and the king is not allowing to sink in via the d6 square. This is the same, and this is the same, waiting for the opponent not to make the progress. And now I hope you understand all of this stuff step by step. I hope understanding the ideas how the opponent can draw, and then learning how the ideas can be implemented to make this winning position will help you to establish the ideas a way better, understand it, and recognize the position with simple calculation in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this stuff. If you have any questions, any comments about the positions or analysis, let me know in the comments, and we are seeing into the next episode. Have a great time. Take care.